Welcome, Magnolia flower painting tutorial with watercolors. Beautiful and magnificent flower. Line drawing is done, and you can see that it's slightly enlarged with elastic eraser, removing excess amount of graphite off the paper. Now to mixing watercolors. I will be using permanent rose together with perylene maroon. Testing on a piece of paper, I see some reds in this maybe looking pink magnolia flower, but there are also other color tones. Perylene violet together with permanent rose. Looking on a piece of paper, how it looks, adding a little bit more of permanent rose, too much, adding separately alizarin crimson, and I like this mix better. So I'm taking alizarin crimson together with perylene violet, painting out, and it looks more as it is in a reference, writing down pigments that I'm using. And another watercolor pigment that I will be using is manganese violet for reflected light areas, which are more subtle, and separately permanent rose because there are pinks as well. Be sure that your water is clean after mixing watercolors, and I'm starting from the side petal. I will not go straight with the middle petal because it's the biggest one and more complex one, so I always warming up from smaller area. What I mean by warming up is even I'm painting on a daily basis, each project needs time to adjust, and that's how I adjust, starting from a smaller area that is not in the middle, not eye-catchy, but still I need to be accurate. So I'm watering and with round synthetic brush applying mix of perylene violet with permanent rose. Warming up with little areas just to adjust and get to know reference. Constantly checking reference, which is right beside my painting, open as well, right beside tutorial or on the other gadget, and follow each area that we are painting. With a finer tip brush, I'm taking watercolors and adjusting outer edges. Painting transparently, be accurate even in the first layers. Don't go straight with dark watercolors. Then you can end up with crisp edges after drying that watercolor layer. This petal is the darkest one, but it doesn't mean that we need to paint straight away super dark. First petal is dry and I'm moving on to the next one. Again, with round synthetic brush, I'm loading my brush with water and applying slightly moist surface to petal. I don't have super large puddles of water, just enough so watercolors can be moved. Taking permanent rose, I can see more pink area in some areas on this petal. And when we see one color, we don't need to apply to the whole area. We can add only in that area that we see in the reference. And this petal closer to outer edge is lighter. Wiping my brush in paper towel and smoothing the applied layer, pushing watercolors towards the outer edge carefully. And here at the lower part of this petal, you can zoom in closer reference. There's a beautiful reflected light area, which is almost white, but it's not completely white. So I want to leave that area light as it is. A little bit of super transparent amount of manganese violet here. And after drying, it will be very, very light. For now, we are painting super transparently and nothing seems like it is in the reference. Be patient. We will be painting quite a long time. This is big painting, quite complex with all those beautiful transitions on each petal to make it to get this movement of this beautiful flower. While the surface is still moist, I'm adding watercolors as I go, and smooth the applied watercolor. Still, everything is transparent. I'm using watercolors that we pre-mixed and constantly checking reference. With finer tip brush, I'm taking Perlin Violet together with Permanent Rose, and I draw those very fine lines that I see in the reference that are in that reflected light area. But remember to leave that reflected light area wider than it appears in the reference. We will paint more and more layers and it will become smaller. Don't leave light area in the beginning as it is in the reference, because towards the end you will cover it completely. Correcting outer edges. And moving on to the next petal, which is this one. This is a little bit more complex than the previous ones because there are quite a few curves, and with tonal values we will get these curves that this petal looks three-dimensional, and there is this movement in this petal, and we need to get it with tonal values. Applying water with round synthetic brush, taking watercolors and applying watercolors where I see is the darkest parts, where are the darkest parts on this petal. Leaving gaps completely unpainted. Another one. Constantly checking reference. As I go, as I paint, I am checking reference image for guidance, for understanding. All the information I need is there. Permanent Rose, here goes also. And now with clean brush, I'm moving watercolors. Again, everything is super transparent. Smooth the applied layer of watercolors. Move watercolors towards the outer edge. And carefully blend together with lighter area. We still need very light transition, gradual from the shadow through halftones to the lightest part. Mixing another amount of permanent rose together with perylene violet. Don't be afraid to run out of watercolor mixes. We can always pre-mix. And if the color tone will slightly change, no need to worry. Your painting will only benefit from it. Moving on to the big petal. Now carefully and slowly you can paint one half and then move to the other half. I'm taking both, all petal together, and starting from the shadow area. I always apply watercolor starting from the shadow, and then I push them towards the lightest part. And here, as I apply shadow area, I'm leaving a little gap between petals. I see in a reference that there is this white edge around each petal. It is much thinner, but for now let's leave it a little bit wider, and as we will paint we can always make it thinner. It's hard to manage straight away with super thin line, so better to make it wider, and later with each new layer while working on the shadow area you can make it thinner and thinner and thinner. Problem is to, if you lose it, to get it back, but not a problem to make something darker. And applying while the surface is moist manganese violet to the right side. It's beautifully curved to the shadow, but it's still not super dark. It's becoming more paler. Working with round synthetic brush, you can take even bigger brush for this petal because this petal is really large and we want to get smooth layer, especially for the beginning part, but also don't worry, we are just starting, and if you are painting transparently, no need to worry. This, as I call it, is ugly stage and we are just starting. Now all petals are dry and we have last petal, which I'm using permanent rose together with perlin maroon. These two little petals at the far left look very red in color tone as I look in the reference photo, and that's why I'm applying permanent rose together with perlin maroon. Outer part is darker, then it's gradual transitions to lighter, and then again at the lower part where it goes behind those big petals, it becomes darker. All little details are important, even for petals that are super in small size visible, but we still need to manage all composition. Don't forget any smallest detail. Everything is important, not just that big petal in the middle, but even the smallest, the tiniest details. Everything is important. Now we can start applying second layers for all petals. I'm applying on dry surface with round synthetic brush. I will be painting quite a lot with the round synthetic brush because of the wide areas of each petal. Finer tip brush for details, for fine lines, to work with edges, but round synthetic brush for applying wider brush strokes. Again, this petal is the darkest one, but we are approaching the darkness gradually and slowly. Adding alizarin crimson together with perylene violet. No worries, the more we mix, the more we learn of watercolor mixing. Washing brush. Don't go straight after you mix watercolor mix, don't go straight with that full brush to your painting. That is too saturated amount. I know that there's a lot of pigment in the brush after mixing, but I always wash it. Or just try to remove as much as possible, but still it's better to wash. Now with finer tip brush, I'm applying here. We see that this petal has a beautiful curve at the very base, and we need to achieve that, leaving a little gap at the very base of the petal. Light, again, there's a beautiful reflected light area, and then the darker part, and then it again becomes lighter. I'm looking carefully at the reference and trying to get the right direction for petal veins. Constantly checking reference if everything is correct. Here, as I painted, I slightly did them wrong, but again, I am doing it transparently, and later on I will with water correct them and draw the right direction. All petal veins are important to see how they are structured, the direction, how they are curving together with the petal. So in this exact petal that is really curved in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different places, veins just can't go straight. They are also curved together with petal. Carefully applying watercolors, especially closer to that white edge. We need to be careful not to lose it. And also for now and for some time during this tutorial, those white edges will be everywhere white, but they are not everywhere white. As the petal goes underneath the flower head, also those white edges will become slightly darker, and that is visible in the reference, and that we'll do later. We can always do something darker, that's not a problem, but I'm trying to keep my brush careful, especially around close to that white line edge, so I'm not losing it. Applying shadow here. Here we have a beautiful cast shadow area, but again, I'm approaching that darkness carefully and gradually. Layer after layer, it becomes darker, and especially careful with that edge, with that white, beautiful edge line. Here it is interesting that I always remind you, don't outline dark edges for petals or leaves. Here is the complete contrary. We have a white edge. So please be careful and keep those edges white. Let's work on this petal. It needs our attention more, permanent rose more. It is in some areas more to the pink side, in some areas more to the violet side. And adjusting those color tones and tonal values. We need to think all the time, not just about color, but also about tonal values, about light, about shadow, and also different color tones in one petal. The outer part is more violet and the lower part is more pinker. Take a closer look at the reference and you will see. Working with round synthetic brush, my surface underneath is dry. Constantly checking with the reference, no matter how long I'm painting, I'm looking and constantly comparing, and the more I look, the more I start to notice new color tones, some details. And here I started to paint more watercolors to veins and also this lower curved part of the petal. More permanent rose. Everything is transparent. Leaving that middle part light. We can clearly see that there's light hitting the area of that surface, of that petal surface, and there's very light area. And I also here noticed that I slightly did my veins of this petal wrong. So with clean and dry brush, I'm smoothing the painted veins previously because they're transparent, and that can be fixed. That's not a big problem. If you would go straight with super dark lines, then that's the problem. So always paint transparently. There are different techniques and you can try. My approach and what I find best for my style and my painting approach is to paint transparently. And here I'm applying more correct veins. Not that they were super wrong, but still the curve area was slightly off. Veins, petal veins are really important. That's where the nutrition goes to flower. And we need to paint them correctly to be botanically accurate. I'm running out of watercolor mixes, so I will premix again Permanent Rose together with Perlin Violet. Applying to my mixing palette. And also I need watercolor mix of Alizarin Crimson together with Perlin Violet. This flower is big and hungry for watercolor layers, and I'm applying many layers. We are already painting half an hour and I did many layers, but still this flower doesn't even come close to reference results, so be patient and paint further with transparent layers. Technique is the same, approach is the same. I'm constantly checking reference, what is going on there, each area, and trusting the process of transparent layers and applying them. Layers dry, and I can paint another layer with watercolors. As you apply layer, first it looks more saturated. After drying, it calms down, soaks into the paper. Different brand papers soak watercolor pigments differently. Some are more hungrier, some are not so hungry, but only through testing you can find which paper suits best for you. So after you apply layer, it looks more saturated. After it dries, it becomes paler. Transparent layers is the key to get rich and full look of your painting. Using very transparent amount of manganese violet, I'm painting this inner petal part that is only one visible here in this composition. Start very light because we need to get this idea of white inner part, but it's in the shadow. Upper part, the curved part is slightly darker, and then gradually it becomes lighter. So with finer tip brush, the upper part of this petal I'm applying slightly darker and pushing watercolors towards the lighter part. Applying permanent rose and with round synthetic brush, I'm glazing some pink watercolor layer over this shadow part because I can see that my painting is lacking pink color tone. In the reference, I see more pink than my painting has, and glazes are a perfect way to adjust. If you don't need a very intense and big shifts in color tones, but slightly need to add this some notion of color tone, then glazes are perfect. Mixing permanent rose with, alizarin crimson with perylene violet and painting another layer. The technique is the same, approach is the same, just new layer. Carefully with finer tip brush, I'm approaching this very narrow area. Don't rush here and don't outline the shadow area with dark outlines. We are separating petals with shadows, but not with lines, but with shadow area. Also here, I'm carefully applying watercolors and with fine brush strokes, making it wider as it appears in the reference. More glazes of permanent rose. These glazes are transparent. Now they look more saturated. After drying, they will be much calmer. But still it needs to be very thin. And using round synthetic brush for smoother and wider applying of this glaze. As I'm glazing this permanent rose watercolor layer, I'm also glazing the lower part of these white edges. Here I'm painting over them. I'm not losing white edge, but I'm making it slightly darker because as it goes underneath flower head, also white becomes slightly darker. Now stem area. I'm taking my watercolor mixing palette, lemon yellow, sap green, and I have some permanent rose and main mix from flower head, so I'm adding those watercolors to my mix and I get brown watercolor mix. Testing on the paper and adjusting it because the beginning part of the stem looks more browner and the other part that goes further from the flower head looks more to the gray side. So I'm adding ultramarine blue to this mix and I have gray, beautiful watercolor mix. Now zooming closer, working with finer to brush because this really small area, applying water. And starting with gray watercolor mix, I apply it to the both outer edges, leaving middle part unpainted. That area is so small that still watercolors will go more into middle, but I have a lighter area in the middle. Outer edges up and down are darker and middle part is lighter. And I'm using watercolors that we pre-mixed. Here we have more gray watercolor mix and closer to the flower head there will be more yellowish browner watercolor mix. And also the ending of the stem, I'm creating this illusion that it fades away. It almost like disappears into the paper. So I will not be super detailed at the further part of the stem to make the illusion that it disappears somewhere in the paper. Here I'm applying the watercolor mix for the brown area that we pre-mixed and adding also a little bit of Indian yellow to make it more brighter. A thing about stem. I know so many are rushing this stage. Take your time. Take your time, maybe pause before starting stem. Dedicate to the stem your attention. The much attention that you gave to flower head, the same attention give to the stem. And here, really, this stem has even 3 different parts. The closer to the flower head, there's more green, and there's little hairs, which we will do a dry brush with little brush strokes. Then there's this more browner area, and then there's gray area. Then there's so much little details like little dots and areas where other stems were attached. So please be patient with stem. To make this composition whole and beautiful and aesthetic, we need to pay stem the required attention it needs in order to make it look realistic. For this little leaf, I'm using sap green with my brown watercolor mix that I have. I just added a little touch of sap green. And with little brush strokes to create this hairy illusion we see in the reference. In this reference photo, it's slightly blurred, but whoever saw in real life Magnolia knows that the leaves, those little sepals that are covering flower bud, are super hairy. And now with the brown watercolor mix, using tip of the brush, I'm going over each detail that I outlined and I also see in the reference. We don't have yet a cohesive look of the whole stem. Here and there some brush strokes and some dots, but everything will come together. Just paint slowly and don't rush the stage. Remember that this stem has also light area and darker areas and half tones. In order to make it look realistic, we need to follow tonal values even on such a narrow area. Adding a little bit more of lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, and manganese violet from watercolor mixes that I already have. A little bit more of lemon yellow to adjust so it looks brown, warmer brown, and going over each little detail that we see. Magnolia stems are really with those little circle parts, and it's really curvy. Stems of Magnolia are really curvy, and we need to get this characteristic look right. Adding Indian yellow to my mixing palette, and where's this brown area, I feel that I need more yellow color tone and warmer. Indian yellow is more warmer, and as it is shadow, it fits there perfectly. More details to the upper part, and there we have a lot little fine brush strokes. But remember that the right side is darker, it's in the shadow, even those brush strokes need to be slightly darker, and then the left side is placed towards the light and is lighter. And there's this little part sticking out, and I'm painting around it to make it visible. And also this little part that I'm painting right now has right side slightly darker and left side slightly lighter. These little details are important to get something look realistic. This stem can do many more layers, many more details with your finer brush. It's up to you to push yourself a little bit further, a little bit more into detailed area. I'm painting detail, but this is just the beginning to get something looking hyper realistic. But I'm really happy with this stage, with this part of the painting where you just constantly adding something new and some new detail, new layer of watercolors, and it looks more and more realistic. It just develops underneath your hands, underneath your brush strokes, and the more you put effort, the more you put attention, the more you are observing reference, the painting becomes richer and richer, and you are just enjoying this stage. In the beginning it was slightly hard while adjusting and warming up and going through the ugly stage, but now it's a bliss to paint. This is the most enjoyable part of all painting. And let's zoom out and have a look at this Magnolia. I'm glazing the reflected light area because reflected light area can't be completely white. It can't be as white as the lightest part. So I'm carefully glazing over them. I'm not losing them. The reflected light area isn't lost, but still it calms down. Some final details, and again, this is the moment you can paint further. If you are painting transparently, if you haven't lost light, this is the moment where you can give extra 30 minutes, hour. Your painting will look wonderful. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I enjoyed making it. Hope you learned something new, and see you in my next tutorials. Thank you.